Do you like sci-fi, fantasy, action, adventure, and comic books? Then you've come to the right place for your weekly dose of anything and everything geek. So strap in and let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Science Fictionary Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Science Fictionary Podcast, presented by the ScienceFictionary.com. I'm Andrew. I'm here today with Marisha.
Hey everybody.
And David.
Hello.
And we are going to continue the Pillars of Fantasy. Tonight we're moving on to the movies category, which turns out to be a lot easier than the TV category. In fact, I couldn't stop. I just kept writing stuff down. And there's some of them that I'm kind of sad probably won't wind up on the final list. I do think I narrowed it down to my top 4. Everybody else got their list together?
I got a list.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we're going to jump right in here. And Marisha, I'll let you go first tonight.
You're going to let me go first tonight. Okay. So are we going to do like we did with novels and just go ahead and knock out the first most obvious? It's okay. I'll just go ahead and pick it. All right. The first choice has to be obviously Lord of the Rings, right? You can't start this conversation without starting with Lord of the Rings. It was the thing, and we've kind of talked about this some. I feel like this movie did for fantasy what Star Wars did for sci-fi, in that all of a sudden people said, you can do this and people will come and see it. This was... And, you know, we've talked about this. Again, it continues 20 years later to hold up. I mean, I literally remember wondering when I saw this movie in the theater when I was 12 years old. Like, I wonder if, like, I know this looks super cool now. I wonder how it's going to hold up. You know, I wonder if 20 years from now when I'm a really old woman, if I'm still going to feel the way that I do now sitting here watching this movie. And I do. This movie is every bit as excellent today. It is every bit as, I mean, if there is a pillar of fantasy in any visual, movies, TV, any of it, this is it.
Right.
Any list of like fantasy, anything, the first image is like 99% of the time going to be from Lord of the Rings.
And we've been very careful with the science fiction stuff and the fantasy stuff of if it was in the literature category that it had to, like most things that made it in the literature category didn't also make it in the TV or movie, even if they had been done.
Right.
Because we tried to put them in the category where they were most relevant.
Right.
Last week we didn't put Wizard of Oz in the literature category because it's honestly more relevant as a movie.
Yeah. And
there were just other things that should have got there ahead of it. And this one is amazing. And I say it's amazing, but the thing is you're literally dealing with one of the greatest mythologies ever written.
Uh-huh.
So in that aspect, the fact that it's so good shouldn't be surprising that you took one of the greatest stories ever written and made one of the greatest movies ever made out of it.
But that doesn't always happen.
It doesn't. It doesn't
Dune,
always.
Anyone? Dune, 1984, anyone?
Right. So it doesn't always happen, but at the same time, it belongs on both lists, and you can't not put it on both lists because all the things that it accomplished as a book, as a series of novels, it turns around and accomplishes those same things again. You can say with the book, we said it dwarfs everything that came before it and inspired and still dwarfs everything that came after it.
Yep.
And you can say the same thing about the movies.
Yep.
It is the pinnacle of high fantasy movie making.
Yep. Everything else wants to be it.
Right.
You know?
It's the thing that all others are compared to. Mm-hmm. Not to mention...
I don't just think it's the...
Go ahead, David.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I don't just think that it's the pinnacle of fantasy filmmaking. I think that it is, and in my humble opinion, the pinnacle of filmmaking.
Yeah.
I cannot express just how much I love these three films. And, I guess we can kind of lump The Hobbit in there as well.
Yeah.
The Middle Earth movies, but really it's the Lord of the Rings franchise. Those three movies. Um, and you're right. Like I had that same thought, and we put it in the literature category, obviously, but it's such a big deal, and it's so important, and it's such a benchmark of fantasy that it has to be brought up in the movies also.
Well,
Um,
and just the
I
sheer
just
number of things
recently,
it's inspired since.
right, exactly, and you're right. It is one of the deepest, most important, most amazing mythologies and universes ever created. Um, it's mind blowing. It's mesmerizing. It's every positive adjective I can think of. I just recently watched these movies because I knew we'd be talking about them here today. Like literally, I finished up Return of the King earlier today, again for the countless time, and I mean, so many feelings and emotions about these movies. And like I just said, I think they're the pinnacle of filmmaking. I mean,
Yeah.
these are my favorite movies. I think that they're the best movies ever made. Um, and you're right. You're talking about how are these going to hold up? They hold up splendidly. They look incredible. Even the stuff that isn't like real, like the CGI, like Gollum. Gollum looks great. Gollum looks as amazing as it did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. These movies are made that long ago. Um, Beautiful scenery, and it brought to the world. What's so important about this is that it did better than any other adaptation bring the wonderful fantasy world that was described in the literature to life.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's you
Filming it
had
in New
a
Zealand was just brilliant.
yeah, that was brilliant. But you also had a director who, while he was filming, sitting in the director's chair with a copy of the book, going page
And you
by
can tell.
page,
Yeah.
making sure that he had the details right.
And he also made I don't remember where I heard this, but I think it was John Howe. So the two like quintessential illustrators of Tolkien's work were John Howe and Alan Rickman.
Not Alan
Not
Rickman.
Alan Rickman. Shoot. Oh, I just had it until I went to go say it. Alan Lee.
Yeah, Alan Lee.
Alan Lee. And so they had Alan Lee on as one of the people doing concept art for the movie. And Peter Jackson kept writing letters to John Howe like, "Hello, sir. We want you to come work for our movie." And, the guy's old at this point, so he's just like not even, he's just like throwing his letters away. So finally, literally, Peter Jackson tracks the man down and knocks on his front door and is like, "Hello, I'm Peter Jackson and I'm making a Lord of the Rings movie. Won't you please come? Won't you please come work on my movie?"
Awesome.
He made really good decisions in that he wasn't so interested in a new vision of Lord of the Rings. Like a lot of times filmmakers
He
feel
didn't want to
like
make it his own.
he didn't want to make it his own. A lot of times filmmakers feel like they have to do something new and edgy and creative to make art. But this man was like, you know what? I'm going to go down and I'm going to track down these guys who are probably my grandfather's age, who have been drawing artwork for Tolkien's literature since the beginning. They have drawn the most beautiful, iconic versions of this world, and I'm going to track them down, and that's what I'm going to base the look of my movie on. I mean, how humble in the first place is that? For him to have the humility to not feel like he had to recreate the wheel, even visually. Not only did he use someone else's work, as the blueprint for his story, he was willing to use someone else's work as the blueprint for the entire look of his movie. But man, did it pay off.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh man, did it pay off.
yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, it established him. Even though he didn't make it his own, it still established him as one of the premier visual filmmakers, like
Yep.
making the most beautiful looking movies. because he just did what was in the book exactly, and you can tell that this movie was made these movies were made with so much love and passion for the source material.
Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings, to me, and I hope y'all agree, is a story about love.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that bleeds through with the way that this movie was obviously made and filmed. Every single scene, every frame of these films, you can tell that everybody involved was putting 110% of their
Yep.
heart and their love and their joy
Mm-hmm.
into making it as incredible as there's the reason that like 5 hour freaking extended versions of these movies exist is because they filmed that much movie
Mm-hmm.
because they wanted to make that much movie. Um, yeah, an incredible accomplishment are these films. And you're right, like it established in the same way that the books established this like huge foundation for fantasy. The movies did it over again.
Yep.
Every race, every terminology, every archetype, everything that we know about fantasy that we love so much. I mean, it started with Tolkien, and this movie kind of brought it all back to life. It introduced, I mean, like, of course, I saw these movies before I even touched even before I even knew that the books existed. Before I
Mm-hmm.
could read, I was seeing
Yep.
these movies, um, and it introduced to me these incredible characters and archetypes that I still love, I still use.
Mm-hmm.
These are uh, all of my a very large majority of my favorite characters in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
If I had a top 10 favorite characters in fiction, I guarantee you 7 of them are from these movies.
Yep.
I relate to all of them so much. I love them all. The acting is incredible across the board. The writing
Mm-hmm.
is gorgeous, and I don't know for sure because I haven't I don't, it's not like I have the books memorized in my head, but I would not be surprised in the slightest if a large majority of the lines that are spoken, especially the ones that stand out as being so beautiful, are directly taken from the books written by Tolkien.
Absolutely.
Especially since
Yep.
you know that Tolkien was a linguist
Yes.
and had such a wonderful way with words, and it all bleeds through
Yep.
in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
I can watch this any second of any day at any time. They will
Yes.
never get old. They are the peak of a film,
Yeah.
in my opinion. I'll be watching them in 20 years. I can't wait to have a kid one day and show him these movies.
Yep. It's pretty fun. Now, I have to say, the first time we watched Lord of the Rings with Iana, she was a very sensitive little soul. She wasn't a huge fan. But we watched it recently. The good thing about having your sensitive child first is that anything that she can watch, the others are enthusiastic to get on board with. So the last time we watched them, it was a much bigger hit. Elijah is 6, and he was all about, the weird things. And the girls are really just old enough now to appreciate just the beauty of it. But yeah, just so much. I think one of my favorite scenes is whenever you've got Pippin in the hall and Gondor singing, and it goes from the hall and then it goes to that battle, and then it like goes back and forth, and all the decisions that Peter Jackson made that were different from the book. Like that one didn't play exactly the same way it did in the book, but oh my gosh, one of the most beautiful, heart-rending scenes ever put on film right
Mm-hmm.
there. I mean, so perfect.
Yeah. Right. So I watched that today, literally because it's in Return of the King, and just
Yeah.
like, dude, like you're right. That's a great example of just like every single frame, every sound,
Yeah.
every visual, every background detail, every speck of dust on the clothes of the actors is there intentionally.
Yeah.
And it's such a beautiful piece of filmmaking. And I love that song, by the way. It's on my
Yes.
playlist.
Mine too. Yeah.
I don't listen to it when I'm wanting to get hyped or anything, but if
Right.
I'm going down the road, I'll put on
Uh-huh.
the music, just the music in general.
Yeah.
Howard Shore
Absolutely.
These are the essential fantasy works. I mean, when I'm playing D&D, you know what my DM has on in the background?
Yeah.
This soundtrack. Um, Everything has a theme. It does that beautiful thing that Star Wars does, where everything has a theme. Like
Yep.
there's the theme that plays when you see the ring.
Mm-hmm.
There's the theme that plays whenever you see Aragorn, and there's the battles, and you have Frodo and Sam's theme. You have the Shire's theme.
Yep.
Frodo and Sam. Never has there been a more loyal friend than Samwise Genji.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love Sam. I love that story. Like I said, it's a story of love. I love their relationship, their story, their triumphs, their ups and their downs. It is such wonderful storytelling. And I know it all started with the incredible books written by Tolkien. But the reason I have so much affinity specifically for the movies is because, I mean, obviously I saw those and it means so much to me as a film. Not even just as a fantasy film, but as a film. And then as a fantasy, it's the most beautiful fantasy movie ever made, the most impressive fantasy visuals ever made. It is everything I think of when I think of the word fantasy, every single inch of it.
Yep.
I'll let everyone else talk now because I've just been going on, but I just love this
We're
movie.
probably going to have to move on, but it's
but there's just so much to say.
It is, and at some point we probably need to circle back and just dedicate
an
entire episode to the works of Tolkien.
Yeah, because I feel like everything that you talk about after, I think there is no Game of Thrones without Lord of the Rings movies.
No.
There's certainly no Witcher, like all of these things that have, really gained traction and have started really to change things in their own right. Even Harry Potter, Andrew and I were talking earlier. I was like, though, I think that there are no Harry Potter movies if Lord of the Rings doesn't take off the way that it does, 2 years earlier. So yeah, just it's hard to say enough about, especially as much as we love them. But yes, we do have many other things. So I guess we should move away from
our...
Well, no, it's fine. I knew that was going to happen with... I knew it was going to... It happened with Lord of the Rings when we talked the novels. The first 15 minutes of that episode are strictly about Lord of the Rings, and first 16 minutes of this one, same thing.
It's the one thing that everyone unequivocally loves.
Yeah, it's the thing that everybody knew was going to be on this list before we started.
Yep.
But David, what do you have at the top of your list?
At the top of my list, of course, Lord of the Rings, but the second best, and this was without hesitation instantly going to be in my top 4. And I'm going to try not to spend as much time on it as I did Lord of the Rings, but trust me, I have a very similar affinity for it, and that is The Princess Bride.
Oh, yes. I'm so glad you said it.
When I was... I first saw this when I was like in 7th grade or whatever, and it just blew my mind of what a film could be. I thought I was going to hate it, right? Because I'm like, The Princess Bride,
right?
What is that? Is that the girly movie? I'm
Right.
like a little 7th grader idiot.
Well, the great thing is you see it as a boy watching it. You literally see it through the eyes of Fred Savage's character. It's like, is this a kissing story?
Exactly. I was that kid 100%, and just like him, I instantly became hooked. Yeah, it's an incredible fantasy movie. It is so much fun. It is so beautiful. It is everything that I love about fantasy. I think it's an incredible movie. It's just great fantasy, dude. I love The Princess Bride.
Have you seen the meme?
To talk about in relevance to this list, huh?
Oh, go ahead.
What?
The meme that's
talk
like...
about it like in relevance to...
I'm sorry.
Come on, y'all.
All right, go ahead. You talk, David. David talks.
Oh, okay. David talks.
Okay.
Let's talk about it in relevance to this list, as in, like making it a pillar. There are actually, surprisingly to me, in my opinion, at least from what I found, there aren't many movies like this that are just
good
old-fashioned fantasy stories about knights and pirates and sword fighter and fighters and giants and princesses and kings and queens and
Yes.
trolls and golems. Like, there's just not that many like it.
No, especially with that kind
This
of
is another.
lighthearted, it almost feels like a B movie, like the humor. You know, it's just, it's so offbeat. But yes, absolutely one of my favorite movies ever. It's just so good.
Timeless.
Yes.
Completely timeless. Wonderful. And just a great fantasy movie. And one of the reasons that I wanted to put it on here and justify it as a pillar is because, like I said with Lord of the Rings, this is a movie that, like, as soon as I have a kid who's able to comprehend film, I'm gonna be showing them this movie. I think it's essential to being a fantasy fan. I think it includes everything fantasy fans love, and I wish that more movies were like it. I wish it was more of a pillar because I wish more people did what Princess Bride did.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so many incredible scenes, funny, memorable lines.
Yeah.
Great characters, great archetypes, great tropes. Andre the Giant is a larger than life superstar.
Yeah.
I love seeing him in this film, especially being a wrestling fan that I am.
Yeah.
Dread Pirate Roberts is like, let me tell you, man, I was addicted to the Dread Pirate Roberts. I wanted to be the Dread Pirate Roberts after I saw this movie.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to find my Princess Buttercup. Yeah, so incredible movie.
Yeah, it's a great one. And I didn't even put it, I had it on my working list just because it, belonged there, but I didn't put it anywhere near my top 4 because I was pretty sure it was going to be your first pick.
And you guessed right. But yeah, have you seen the meme? It's like, what kind of movie are we going to watch? Let's watch a romance, Princess Bride. Let's watch a comedy, Princess Bride. Let's watch a fantasy, Princess Bride. You know, like all of the categories. It checks off all of the boxes.
Right.
You know, it's the
that is exactly it.
Yes, but absolutely, I'm with you. I think, like, please, oh great Hollywood movers and shakers, do not remake The Princess Bride. But please give us more things like The Princess Bride.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely more things in that vein. I don't need to see it remade, although the Princess Bride at Home thing that they did a few weeks ago
have you
is
seen
pretty
that?
funny.
No, I haven't.
It's a whole bunch of actors that filmed themselves reenacting scenes at home, and they cut it all together to make The Princess Bride. So you get things like
that's
Jack Black as
Princess Buttercup.
No, Jack Black was Wesley.
Was Wesley?
It was the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Yeah.
And honestly,
I know you guys don't watch wrestling, but like this is like you guys know who the Big Show is?
Yeah. Okay, so I watched wrestling probably up until the 2002, 2003, and I just haven't kept up with it since.
All right. So the Big Show, but also the Big Show is kind of one of those guys that broke into culture.
Right.
If you remake The Princess Bride, please, I know it might seem like, oh, let's do this. Do not get the Big Show to play to play the giant.
No.
Please.
All right, so I'm going to move on real quick, just so we don't end up making a 3-hour episode here, but because those are movies we could all sit here and talk about, and again, that's another one that we could do a whole episode about that.
Absolutely.
So I've got a couple of things from the early era of cinema that I kind of tried to convince myself to not put them because not putting them on there means some things that I really love probably aren't going to make the list. But I can't see making a list and calling it the Pillars of Fantasy and not putting 1932's The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, on this list. This is, you're talking early movie. You're talking like the origin of monster movies, like of big monster movies in the theater.
What year is that?
1932.
Okay.
They're still remaking this movie.
Yeah.
In fact, they remade the version made in the late 90s, early 2000s with
Brendan Fraser.
With Brendan Fraser is a fantastic adaptation.
Such a good.
It's a seriously underrated action adventure film in its own right.
I agree.
But this movie is I didn't want this subgenre of fantasy to get left off the list because it is important. This one is, the story's a little different, but I mean, they even just remade this a few years ago with Tom Cruise. It is one of the most important monster movies that's ever been made.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I'm putting it on here as my first entry.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I love some Boris Karloff representation on here, so that's cool.
That was the other thing, is you're kind of looking at this and you're going, man, it's like he belongs in here somewhere.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Marisha?
Right, is it my turn?
Yes, back to you.
Back to me. All right. So I see your mummy and I'll raise you a Dracula. A year before the mummy was Bela Lugosi as Dracula. And y'all, everything from Hotel Transylvania to The Count on Sesame Street to every single iteration of a vampire.
What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh my gosh, What We Do in the Shadows. Even Interview with the Vampire to some extent.
All inspired by
Bela Lugosi's Vampire. I mean, like, anytime you see a kid in a Halloween costume as Dracula, it's like, that's what they're doing. They're doing the slick back hair and the high collared cape and it is the quintessential rendition of, like, every other version of Dracula. That's what it's drawing from. The accent, everything is so incredibly iconic that even if you have never seen the movie, you know it.
Yeah.
It has inundated pop culture just, up until the godforsaken sparkly vampires. This was the rendition of vampires.
Nearly every vampire movie that's ever been made has paid some tribute to Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
And even series, like, I didn't watch the Vampire Diaries, but I did watch the originals because it was set in New Orleans. And Being Human, and they both kind of had some of the, like, oh, vampires as good guys sort of trope going on. But, like, the look, like, there's no accident that they cast Sam Witwer as the vampire in Being Human, because he's got that same look, that kind of, the dark hair and the kind of gaunt face. He's got the kind of look going. So yes, super iconic. And
when was this made?
1931.
Jeez. Okay, because I'm thinking about, when I hear Dracula, what actually comes to my head is the Christopher Lee Dracula. But
yes,
but of course it sounds like that movie would not exist, of course, without the one you're speaking of.
Oh, that one is based so heavily on this one, on the 1931 version.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all drawing from Bram Stoker's Dracula, obviously, but they're like, Boris Karloff created what everyone pictures as a vampire for, almost it's almost been 100 years.
You mean Bela Lugosi? You said Boris Karloff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bela Lugosi.
Yeah.
Created what we think of when we talk about a vampire, and it's been almost 100 years, and it's still, there have been some, in the last little bit, there's been some newer takes on vampires, but you still see movies made, like, What We Do in the Shadows. You still see things being done that are drawing heavily from the Bela Lugosi version.
Yep.
All right, David, what have you got next?
My next one is it's hard to see. I didn't really put mine in a particular order past Princess Bride. So I'm gonna go with The Wizard of Oz as my next
yes, indeed,
entry on the list. And it's like we talked about, it was a book, but I think this is probably one of the most influential, not just fantasy movies, but movies of all time. Fantasy tends to have that theme, doesn't it? And I think I've read stuff like, oh, actually, technically, this movie was made blah blah blah, blah, but wasn't this the first movie to be put into color?
I believe that goes to Gone with the Wind. I'm pretty sure that
Really?
Gone with the
Okay.
Wind was the first.
Okay.
I'm
See, I
pretty sure
wasn't
Gone
sure
with the
because
Wind
I've
was
I've
made in
always
1932.
right. I've always read that The Wizard of Oz was the first movie to be put into color, but maybe that's just wrong. But still, it's obviously one of the first. But either way,
Now,
yeah,
The
The Wizard
Wizard
of
of
Oz.
Oz did color in such a creative way. The fact that they used the Technicolor in the movie as a plot device is just brilliant.
Right.
Yeah, truly, it really, really is. And yeah, but The Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's one of the most popular movies ever made. Everybody's seen The Wizard of Oz. A lot of what people understand about fantasy, witches and wizards and magic and godmothers and fairies and stuff like that, and you know other magical other lands and stuff like that. It all starts from The Wizard of Oz, and that's an important part of the Pillars topic is what what does this contribute to the general audience's understanding of fantasy? And this is definitely a very important movie for that particular thing. Everyone has seen this movie countless times,
Yes.
right? And of course, I mean, the most iconic witch
Yep.
of all time, a beautiful fantasy world also. And you're right, like it's great how they use the color and it creates this beautiful, amazing fantasy world and journey that is so important for filmmaking. Is looking and saying like, how can we make our movie visually interesting, and fantasy is a big part of that. Like, I feel like that sentence was confusing. What I was trying to say, like, fantasy is one of the leading industries, I guess you would say, or genres when it comes to making visually interesting movies.
Right.
And Wizard of Oz is a very, very, very
Yes.
big stepping stone in that. That's what I was trying to get
Yes.
across there. And it's a wonderful movie, a wonderful story, full of fantasy archetypes that everybody can understand and relate to and follow. Everybody knows The Wizard of Oz. Everybody's
Yes.
seen The Wizard of Oz.
It's enough of a cultural touchstone that they could make a joke in Avengers about flying monkeys, and Captain America gets that
Right.
reference. It's like it's
I
that
understood that reference.
a
Yeah.
movie. I mean, let's think about that for a second. A movie that was that much of a cultural touchstone in the 40s, y'all. I mean, my grandmother was born in 1941. My grandmother didn't even see this movie when it came out. This movie came out before my grandmother was born. And my children and all of their peers know what you mean when you say flying monkeys. That is incredible. This movie is 80 years old. And it is something that is still such a part. Not only not only have you seen sort of riffs on the theme, like with Dracula, everybody has seen this dadgum movie. So yeah, it's got to be one of the most important movies ever made, not just for fantasy, but such an important part of the culture. And the music's great too.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a cultural touchstone. It's part of the mythology that's been created in this country. Our cinema. It's part of what built Hollywood. Now, there were movies, as far as the color, just a little factoid. I mean, there were movies being made as early as. So one of the first ones I see credited as fully filmed in color was in 1918, a movie called Cupid Angling. And I see
I don't know where I've heard.
No, you've heard that because it was one of the first like it was kind of when the Technicolor had been around. Technicolor was actually used to make a movie in 1917, a movie called The Gulf Between. But it was, the process was still kind of coming into its own. And Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz both released in 1939 and were both shot in Technicolor. And because they were so huge, and they're so often they're considered, a lot of times Wizard of Oz gets mentioned because of the way the color was used in the movie, because of this spectacular transition in the movie from black and white to color, that it just registers with people as being the first movie in color.
But now, it's probably the first movie that most people saw in color.
That and Gone with the Wind, yes. But there were color movies, hand-colored movies going all the way back to 1902.
Right. That's a completely different.
Right. That's not shot in color. The thing is color, creating a film in color was incredibly expensive.
Right.
At this point in time. So that's why you had some movies doing it and a lot not. But The Wizard of Oz is certainly one that has to be on the list. But the next one I've got is actually a competitor, was competition for The Wizard of Oz when it came out, just a little less than about 6 months later. A movie called The Thief of Baghdad, which is actually a remake of a really, really early version of The Thief of Baghdad that was actually an early, like in the 1920s, it was a silent film.
Okay.
But this one is the one that most people know. It was full color. It was excellently made. It's actually a story made about one of our Pillars of Fantasy books, which was the 1001 Arabian Nights. This is a story from that. This is actually the predecessor. You don't get, at least, you may not get it at all. This is basically where Disney drew for its Aladdin movie.
Well, yeah, the senator advisor named Jafar and a thief named Abu.
This is that story, minus a few things. There's no genie. I think there's a magic crystal ball. There's a flying horse. But it's a beautiful movie. But it's one that borrows from things that were incredibly important pieces of literature, fantasy literature, and is really a big part of what brought the knowledge of the Arabian Nights literature to the forefront in America. It's what made people aware of it. And it has gone from there. But again, it's essentially the same story that's done later by Disney in Aladdin. We watched some of it earlier, but one of the kids walked in, our oldest daughter walked in the room, watched for 2 minutes, and immediately recognized that she was watching Aladdin.
Oh, that's cool.
So that's my next entry on the list. The Thief of Baghdad.
Awesome. All right, does that put us back at me?
It puts us back at you.
All right, good. Well, I'm glad you took Wizard of Oz because that was going to be my next thing. The next thing I think that I have to bring up is Walt Disney's Snow White. Because, I mean, fantasy for decades was the purview of children and was the purview of the Walt Disney Company. You know, I mean, Walt Disney still makes bank, not exclusively, but largely based on its image of the fairy tale, Disney World and the Magic Kingdom, and it's the happiest place on earth. And all of that starts with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, this is the movie that built Disney.
Yeah. I mean, and again, such an important movie in so many ways. It's obviously the movie that made Disney one of the biggest things under the sun.
Right. I mean, I would say just being the movie that built Disney is enough to put it on the list all by itself.
But it's also the movie that made cartoons a thing. I mean, this is the first long like feature length cartoon movie. Prior to that, you'd had little shorts, things. But I mean, what a mammoth undertaking for somebody to be like, no, we're going to do this thing. You know how you do those 3-minute shorts? Yeah, we're doing a 2-hour movie. So incredibly iconic. Now this one, like Disney later on managed to kind of tone down some of its stuff a little bit, but this one, y'all, managed to hang on to some of that scare the children into being good sort of thing that the Brothers Grimm had going on. It was definitely, this one scared me as a kid. Like that witch, turning into that hag. That's not for the faint of heart.
Right. No, this one drew very heavily from the Grimm brothers version.
Yeah. And, as Disney fairy tales went on, I think the longer they've gone, the less they really have relied on their source material. But this one, I mean, again, it's still something that this movie was made in the 30s. I mean, this movie is coming up really quickly on 100 years old. And it is still something that every child knows. Every little girl has seen this movie. And she made her brothers watch it at some point too, because it's one of those stories. Now, of course, part of that is the Disney marketing machine that, shoves princesses in your face whether you want them or not. But part of it is just, even if there were no Disney marketing machine, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is still such an important contribution to filmmaking and to fantasy, because all of a sudden it makes fairy tale movies a thing.
Right.
And that, has continued on until this, everybody makes fairy tale movies. It's just, and I think we'll continue to, as long as there are movies, people will make fairy tale movies for children, because Walt Disney decided to do this one back all those years ago. So that's my next selection. How about you, David? What you got next?
Yeah. Great entry. It was on my working list for sure. Next on my list, and this is another thing that we did end up putting on our literature list, but I think it's so important as a movie that it's worth being talked about here, and that is the Harry Potter franchise. Bit more recent than some of the stuff we've been talking about, and it's also one of those things where if you, I'm not overly attached to it if you guys think that it has enough representation being on the literature list, but I think that as movies, it sort of in the same way where Lord of the Rings made a big impact as a book and then as a movie did the same thing. I think this sort of did the same thing where it's a big deal as a book, but then it comes out in movies, and suddenly for a long time, for those 10 years that that these movies were coming out, they really did rule the box office. They were some of the biggest movies that were coming out those years. I mean, I remember my 11th birthday or whichever birthday it was, I went to go see the midnight premiere because it happened to come out on my birthday. And the line was wrapped around the very large AMC building here in where I live. Everybody wanted to see this movie. It was the talk. It was what everybody talked about were these fantasy or these Harry Potter movies.
Yeah.
It's what everybody knows when they think of wizards. And yes, the books are a big deal, but I mean, it's hard to argue against the fact that without these movies, there are many, many people who would not know about the books. And it probably got a lot of people to read the books.
Yeah.
And pretty much like spells, magic, wands, wizards, a lot of what people know about it comes from the Harry Potter franchise and the movies. And I think they're pretty good movies. I mean, I haven't read the Harry Potter books, but I think that they're from what I sorry I think I read the first one. But from what I've been told, they're really good adaptations of them. I think Daniel Radcliffe is a treasure.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy these movies introduce us to him. Please cast him as Wolverine. Thank you. And I enjoy the movies, and I think they were such a big deal, uh, just as films that I couldn't help but put them on my list.
Yeah, oh yes, and let us not forget, they introduced us into the well-beloved "let's turn the last book into two movies" trope. Hooray! Thank
My
you,
favorite one.
Harry Potter, everyone's favorite. No, now of course that in its defense, that book was way longer. That was a really, really long book. It probably needed two movies, but all the adaptations that have decided to do that did not. But that's just my opinion. But
I
yeah, no,
agree.
it seems like everybody who hasn't read the books has seen the movies.
Right.
And I think that's, it's been really important as, I mean, obviously, the books are responsible for a large number of children who read at all, I imagine. But I think you're right. The movies have been really influential in cementing the popularity of the books, because especially since the movies were coming out kind of as the books were coming out. In some ways, I almost feel like the movies sort of created the books, as far as how they're perceived by people. Because it's not like we had our own picture of Aragorn for 30, or 40 years, and then we got the movie and we're like, oh, that wasn't my Aragorn in my head. It was like, he was everyone's Harry Potter, because he was Harry Potter, like literally as the books were coming out, he was Harry Potter. So, yeah. It's a good one. I like me some Harry Potter.
Yep, that's another good
And
one.
anything that's a big enough deal to have its own theme park.
Right, and that's the thing. It has a
point.
theme park. It has a part of a theme park at one of the major theme parks, and it has certainly inspired the studios to all rush out looking for the next Harry Potter.
Yep. I think that the fact that Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings were sort of coming out at the same time was one of those things that all of a sudden everyone was like, oh my gosh, must find fantasy. And I think that's in a lot of ways responsible for some of the really high quality fantasy.
Well, that's one of the things. I mean, there was an article just last week about, Netflix really is looking hard for Netflix wants to create the next Harry Potter movie franchise. They're looking for that thing to be the next Harry Potter. Okay, so my next entry is another one that I love this. I used to watch this with my dad all the time as a kid, but it's not, it's one of those that's
maybe not held up as well as
it has and hasn't. It's interesting, but the thing is it was created by someone whose name almost has to be on this list. If this movie's not on this list, then his general works end up on the miscellaneous list, and that's Ray Harryhausen, who created all of these fantastic fantasy stories through the use of stop motion animation. Claymation monsters. I mean, so basically the one I'm pulling is Jason and the Argonauts. That is generally considered to be Ray Harryhausen's masterpiece. It is based on the Greek hero, Jason. It follows him through the stories with, all these different mythological creatures that he has to go kill, and with his run-ins with Hera and Zeus. And if you've never seen these, this was preceded by The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which was much lower budget. This was done with a much larger budget, but still done stop motion. It is one of the, I would say absolutely one of the must-see pieces of fantasy. And if you're a fan of just movie making, this is an incredibly important step. And it is one of the most important stop motion movies ever made. And for those reasons alone, that's my next choice.
All right, so it's my turn again. Indiana Jones. Because speaking of things that inspired all that came after it, How many things have you seen that were a direct ripoff of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Not that Raiders of the Lost Ark didn't kind of take tropes. I mean, obviously, it took a lot of things from the same sort of things that inspired Star Wars, the same sort of action adventure things. I mean, obviously different, not the same stories, but the same sort of serials and action adventure shorts and things like that. But the combination of the adventurer, who also is a scholar, who also has run-ins with some weird stuff, monsters and spirits and whatever was in the Ark of the Covenant that was just uncanny. So lots of really sort of elements, and it's one that movies have been ripping on ever since. I feel like
Are you picking the Indiana Jones
I'm just
like as a whole? Or
yeah, I think I'm going as a whole because they kind of like I know that they're kind of distinct, but like in my mind, I sort of see them all, kind of like as an entity, sort of like Star Wars, So you've got this kind of supernatural tinted adventure story has been. I mean, it's been done so many times. And I think most noticeably, like, I feel like the Mummy that they did in the 90s was very, very Indiana Jones.
Yeah. If you're looking to distinguish an action adventure subgenre of fantasy,
This has to be it.
this is the movie or the movies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say the three, the trilogy, because the
Yeah.
fourth one falls heavily
it's
into
very
science
sci-fi.
fiction.
Yeah. But the original three, very supernatural.
Yeah, I had thought about Pirates of the Caribbean for this list, and that was on my working list. But I think that having Indiana Jones kind of captures that same action adventure fantasy thing that Pirates of the Caribbean would fit into, and a lot of other different movies. So I think it's a good entry.
Yeah, and in that way, I would say that Pirates of the Caribbean is kind of a predecessor or an heir to that type of action adventure with the fantasy elements thrown in.
I mean, it's definitely not pure fantasy. It's definitely got a lot of other things going.
Right.
But if you have no fantasy elements, you have a very different story.
Right. And
you just have the booby traps. But it's definitely not just booby traps.
Right. Oh, I mean, you
that
run
dadgum arc melted those people.
well,
that's not a thing found
one of
in
Arthur's
nature.
knights, and,
Yes.
or at least one of the Knights Templar, and all of these, is a ghost, and all these different things. And, yeah, it certainly has fantasy elements run throughout.
And not to mention, y'all, such a daggum wonderful movie experience. Like, I'm typically not into like creepy in any way, shape, or form, but Indiana Jones, Last Crusade, absolutely one of my favorite movies ever. So there we go.
All right, David, what do you have next?
So this was a really, really difficult choice for me. I desperately wanted to put Shrek on my list.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons. Hilarious, incredible movie. And then, and I think an argument could be made for Shrek. If we had more room on the list, I would put Shrek on the list. Great fantasy tropes, great parody. But then I started thinking about it, and I thought about another movie I really wanted to put on the list. And I think that this is sort of the predecessor to Shrek in many ways. And it's not very obvious at first, but I think it is. And that is Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail.
Ha ha ha! You took Andrew's last thing on his list.
I can do Shrek, man.
No, it's fun.
Do you have another one, Andrew?
Oh yeah, I've got another one.
All right.
I was literally sitting here writing it on the master list as my next entry, though.
That's great.
But no,
you can see where I made the jump from Shrek to this.
Yes, absolutely.
And I love all the Monty Python movies, all the Monty Python skits. It's my kind of comedy that I really, really enjoy. That a lot of people my age, I try to show them Monty Python movies, and they don't enjoy it quite as much as me. But when I showed them Quest for the Holy Grail,
Right.
that's the one that they get. That's the one where they're like, this is gold. It's one of my favorite movies. I saw it in like ninth grade, I think, for the first time, and I've been in love with it ever since. So freaking funny, just the perfect parody of fantasy and knights and quest and adventure. One of the funniest scenes, one of the hardest I've ever laughed at any movie ever, was with the Black Knight when he cut off his limbs, and the Black Knight is still trying to fight, and he's like hopping on one leg. And he's like, it's but a flesh wound. The pure, like, just the laughter that flooded out of me when I saw that for the first time. I love that movie so much. I love that scene. And just like the king of the parody of fantasy is the Quest for the Holy Grail.
Absolutely.
Hilarious, great adventure story when you really think about it. It's a great quest movie, but just full of comedy and playing with all those tropes and introducing them and showing them in such a great light. Great movie.
Yes. Absolutely good selection. All right.
If we have Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on the on the side, then I think this is the perfect entry to sort of fill that same slot.
It does.
Comedy in this genre.
It does the exact same thing that Hitchhiker's Guide showed, that it was okay to have to be irreverent about science fiction.
Yeah.
And this did the same thing for fantasy. It said you can tell a fantasy story with this irreverent sense of humor. And
you can tell because man, this has inspired so much stuff. I mean, even VeggieTales, for heaven's sake. If you have ever watched VeggieTales, those French peas are straight up doing the Monty Python shtick.
Yeah. Everything does the Monty Python shtick.
Yep.
Well, not to mention, I mean, they did some things about the Arthur story better. I mean, even though they did it tongue in cheek, they still did some things better about the Arthurian stories than any other movie has ever done. It's kind of like the best Robin Hood movie ever made is Robin Hood Men in Tights. I mean, because even though it's crazy and weird and goofy, it does the same. It does the same thing.
I don't know. I love me some Errol Flynn Robin Hood.
Errol Flynn's Robin Hood is good.
There is no Carrie Elwes Robin Hood without Errol Flynn Robin. He is Errol Flynn Robin Hood. That's
true. Okay, so since David got that one, I'm going to grab another one that I really thought needed to be on this list, and I wasn't sure if it was going to make it, but now I'm just going to grab it. And I'm going to add Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It's kind of another late entry.
Yeah.
I think 2000. But it is a movie that it brought that kind of mystical element of martial arts films to the forefront. It's certainly the biggest example of it out there, but it's something that ever since has been this Ang Lee's style has been duplicated by so many martial arts since. But even things we've watched recently, like
Into the
Badlands, really digs heavily into that mystical style of martial arts film. And it fills a really important gap, our genre types, our subgenres.
This movie was so big. I was shocked when I finally watched it because, of course, I wasn't allowed to see it when I was a kid because it had nudity.
Right.
But I was really shocked when I watched it recently. And the daggum movie is in Mandarin.
Yeah.
Y'all, I really, as big as this movie was, I just knew for sure it was an English language film. It is really a testament to the quality of this movie that it got so much traction in the U.S. when it is a straight up Chinese movie.
It made $128 million in the U.S. market, which I don't know if that's still true. I suspect it is, but was at the time the largest grossing amount for a
foreign film.
For a foreign language film.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And like you said, it's totally now has inundated English language films. I expect we're going to see a whole lot of this kind of stuff in Mulan when Mulan comes out.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that is my last one on the list. Now, that only brings us up to 12,
So we probably need to.
which I don't think is quite enough to really round this list out well if everybody has one more.
Okay. I could definitely come up with
And
one
if
more.
everybody's got time to go one more.
I've got time to go one more, but real quick, I have to interject. I think that I slid into another universe because I could have sworn that the movie was called Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail.
You know, I've thought
But
that too, but it's just
it's
Monty
called
Python and the Holy Grail.
and the whole. I think that we might have slid into. I think me and you slid
You got some Mandela effect going
to
there?
another universe. All right, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to choose from. Right, I'm gonna go with Peter Pan. What I wanted to go with, because my first initial thought was, oh, Hook, because I love Hook
Right.
so much. Um, but of course, you don't have Hook without Peter Pan.
Right.
A fantastic fantasy movie. One of the earliest movies I ever saw, I'm sure. The World of Neverland is one of the most wonderful fantasy worlds ever. Every kid wants to go to Neverland. The character of Peter Pan is extremely iconic. One of the most iconic fantasy characters, especially for kids like that. Like he's like an icon for children, you know. Captain Hook, one of the best villains of all time.
Absolutely.
It's a great movie. It's another one that like all kids know, and you know you could say that by putting Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on the list, that it covers pretty much all the Disney animated movies, which I could totally see that argument. But I
Yeah.
think Peter Pan is special enough on its own that I really wanted to put it on the list.
Yeah. I think so. Well, since you pulled another Disney movie, I'm going to resist the urge to bring up Little Mermaid or Aladdin, both of which I think have some merit on this list of their own, just because Aladdin is kind of the beginning of fairy tales, you know, kind of that tongue in cheek, a little more adult humor in fairy tale movies, which kind of carried over into things like Shrek, and Little Mermaid because it sort of relaunched fairy tales is a thing that Disney did after having not done it for so long. But since you just did Peter Pan, I'm going to just leave those at that, why they should have been considerations. And I am going to go with The Never-Ending Story.
Never ending story.
Yes. Which, you know, has admittedly not aged quite as well as some other things that we could mention, but was such an important, it was so important culturally, and I think was really important it was not only really important for fantasy stories at the time that it was made, it's one of the things that sort of tided fantasy over between Disney's, you know, princess movies in the, you know, up through the 50s through Sleeping Beauty. You know, after Sleeping Beauty really didn't do very well, they kind of just said, forget it. And so, you know, fantasy in a lot of ways, especially that style of fantasy kind of floundered a little bit. But, you know, there's something really special about things like Neverending Story and Labyrinth that have continued to be really, you know, the creatures, you know, Jim Henson's creatures, and just the really the story is really excellent, you know, just on the merits. You know, of course we've established that being excellent doesn't necessarily make it on this list. It was one of those things that you couldn't be in the world and not hear about. Even though it was kind of weird and a little niche, I think that it was an important kind of connective tissue for fantasy between, you know, some of the things that came before and the things that really sort of brought fantasy to its own, you know, around the turn of the century. So that's my last contribution to the list.
All right. So
Look,
I've got a number of things here, and I'm having a real hard time wrestling it down to
yeah,
one.
we're gonna have to do some honorable mentions.
Yeah, for sure. But the one I'm going to go with is one. is something that we don't really, I kind of have one that kind of falls in the sword and sandal category, but it's a little different. It's early, it's stop motion. But I'm going to put Conan the Barbarian on this list.
I almost did.
It is
the Arnold Schwarzenegger one?
Yes. Yeah, the 1982 Conan the Barbarian.
Good.
Which I don't know if you're aware, they're actually making a sequel to that right now.
With
Really?
Arnold Schwarzenegger?
With Arnold Schwarzenegger. But this is one that it certainly falls well within that. I mean, I call it sword and sandal, but it's I guess really it's more sword and sorcery. It's kind of falls in line on both.
A little bit of both.
Of course, carries over from very important, very successful books, comic books, all sorts of those things. And I think maybe even an short-lived animated series at some point. It was really, I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger had been around for about a decade before he did this movie, but I think this was the movie that really made Schwarzenegger a household name.
Mm-hmm. This is what got him Terminator.
Right. He did this one, and a year later, or 2 years later, he was the Terminator. So I really feel like because of this one, while we did have another sword and sandal thing on here, we really didn't have anything that fell into that really worked with this barbarian archetype that is pretty important in the fantasy genre. And as far as the barbarian archetype goes, this may still be the most famous barbarian movie ever done. So that's why that's going to be my last entry on the list.
Awesome.
All right. Did anybody have any like honorable mentions they wanted to throw out? I think we're going to round the list out at 16, but
okay.
Did anybody have any other names they wanted to throw out there before we wrapped up?
Disney's what was it? Was it called The Sword and the Stone?
Yeah.
Yep.
Their King Arthur movie. Probably my first introduction into the King Arthur mythos and a lot what I know about it. That I almost put Star Wars on the list.
Yeah.
Of course. But we had it on the sci-fi. You know,
we talked about it for an hour.
I'm just gonna. I was like, yeah, we're not gonna. I was like, let's not touch that one.
Yeah.
Jumanji was almost on my list.
Right, I have
Mary
that
Poppins
one.
was almost on my list.
I have that one.
Yeah.
Willy Wonka was almost on my list.
One
Willy Wonka. But I should have done Willy Wonka instead of the Never-Ending Story. Willy Wonka is way better than Never-Ending Story.
Well, do you want to make the argument for why? Well, we can consider changing it. The episode's not over.
It's not set in stone.
It's not set in stone until I wrap this episode.
Way more people have seen Willy Wonka than have seen Never-Ending Story.
We could. I'm fine with that.
If we're talking cultural lexicon, oompa, oompa, oompa dee doo. Like, I've seen people making jokes about, like, you know, every month I expect exactly. I expect to see the Oompa Loompas come out and start singing about, you know, what we should have learned and didn't. So I think cultural lexicon wise, Willy Wonka, and that was on my list. Wasn't that on my list? How did I missed it? Yeah. But I think that Willy Wonka is such an important. I mean, so weird.
So you want to?
I'm gonna switch Never-Ending Story for Willy Wonka.
Okay,
that's a better.
Then that covers it. So you mentioned Labyrinth. I almost put Labyrinth on the list.
It's on my work.
And I thought Never-Ending Story kind of touched that same thing, and yeah.
Well, we could always do both because
we could always let everybody throw their honorable mentions out there and see about if there's any that jump out that we want to.
Yeah.
I'm okay with going 3 more on the list. We just got to do it quickly.
Yeah.
So you pretty much named most of what I had. The only thing, I had the Dark Crystal, I had Labyrinth. I think y'all mentioned those. Star Wars is, of course, one we haven't talked about. And we did discuss back when we were doing science fiction which one it belonged in. And I think what I ultimately arrived at is that while it is fantasy, it's been far more influential
as science
fiction.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where I landed on it too. It's like, yes,
that's fair.
It's technically maybe fits the genre better for fantasy, but it's the thing that made science fiction a thing.
Right.
It was science fiction enough in people's minds that it sort of jump-started science fiction as a genre. My honorable mention was going to be Cinderella. Okay.
The one thing that I have that really hasn't been mentioned other than Star Wars is Toy Story.
Yeah.
Ooh, I like that.
So if we want to quickly add one more to the list, assuming that Neverending Story is off, would you want to put Neverending Story back in addition to Willy Wonka, or?
I don't know. Why don't we vote? I don't care. Y'all vote.
I mean,
I'm fine with that.
I would say that Neverending Story or something like Labyrinth, which very much hit those same notes about the same time. Mm-hmm. I would say one of those two should be on the list.
I've never seen Labyrinth, which is why I went Neverending Story, because I have seen Neverending Story.
What do you think, David?
If I had to vote, I would say Labyrinth personally.
I think Labyrinth may hold up a little better, and I love the Neverending Story.
David Bowie's in it, so that's why I would vote for Labyrinth. But I don't want to cramp on Marisha's style here with leaving out.
Marisha's not attached to Neverending Story.
Okay. I saw Labyrinth at a very early age, and was very fascinated by Labyrinth, I'll say.
Yeah. I mean,
Labyrinth really sticks with me.
Labyrinth and Neverending Story are both pretty big. And like I said, they're about the same time, hit most of the same notes.
Well, and like I said, that's the only reason that I brought out Neverending Story is because that's the one I had seen. But I do hear probably people talk more about Labyrinth.
Yeah, I would say Labyrinth has remained more relevant, which is kind of a shame. But Neverending Story is one of those few that I would say, please remake it. Because the movie doesn't do the story justice. David, so as far as one more to throw out there, what would you say?
One more to throw out there? Looking at all these, and, I think I would love to say Jumanji, but I don't think that it quite fits what we're going for here, even though I love you, Jumanji. I'm going to go with The Sword and the Stone. Because do we even have a King Arthur thing? I don't even think we had a King Arthur thing on there. And I know that there was like a live action
we got Monty
movie
Python.
called Excalibur that was. Oh, we had Monty Python, yeah. But I think we need I think it would be fair to have another King Arthur
and
thing.
Excalibur is actually a good movie if you've never watched it.
I've
never seen Excalibur, and I just read about it when researching. It didn't seem like that big of a deal, but also didn't see many other King Arthur movies that were made. So I'd say either one or those two, and I'll leave that one to y'all. Either Sword in the Stone or Excalibur.
I think Sword in the Stone has definitely been a more enduring.
I would say Sword in the Stone because of the influence it had on children and
the Sword in the Stone,
passing those stories on to children, which is always important.
Exactly. I think it's the one, even though it's weird, I think it's one that managed to. A lot of movies have tried to do King Arthur, and most of them have done it very poorly. Camelot was well received, but that was because it was a Broadway musical. So yeah, I think Sword in the Stone probably gets the cake on King Arthur selections.
All right, so the one that I'm going to throw out there, I already mentioned, it's Toy Story.
Yeah, I think so.
Great entry.
Yeah,
first Pixar movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that entry.
Yeah, I think that's a good one.
Guys, I'm so freaked out. So I'm just scrolling through Instagram, and of course, I just saw a picture. It was a meme with a screenshot from The Sword and the Stone. They're always listening.
Pretty much. But anyway, I think that's gonna Toy Story is gonna round out our list of
that's excellent.
Pillars of Fantasy. And Toy Story, I mean, we didn't really say much about it, but it was obviously made for kids, but it is I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who's like, oh, I don't like Toy Story.
It's like, what if Chucky wasn't creepy?
Well, it's one of those things that we've talked about, and that I'm trying to write an article about for the website about the relationship between fantasy and science fiction, and that fantasy somewhat requires your inner child to still be there. Science fiction can be cold and not doesn't require that inner child to enjoy, but fantasy sort of does, because it's not real. It's so fantastical, and I this is one that really just kind of wakes that inner child up in almost everybody that watches it.
One of the best film franchises ever made. All four of those movies are excellent.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a really good and really important film franchise. So I'm really glad to be able to put that one on the list to round it out. So I guess that's going to wrap us up for the Pillars of Fantasy in our movie category, which just leaves us with one more category to go. That will be our miscellaneous category, which if you didn't listen to the science fiction, the Pillars of Science Fiction, the miscellaneous category is where we try to find the things that have had a heavy influence on fantasy storytelling in the modern genre, but didn't quite fit in the categories of movies, TV, or literature.
Yep.
And we had a lot of things last time.
Video games, plays.
Right. I mean, we had
creators.
We had magazines and things like that in the comic strips, film shorts. So
just general kind of concepts,
Yeah.
General sort of
sound work
movements.
by sound technician work, like people like Ben Burt, and soundtrack work like from people like John Williams.
Yes, absolutely.
So looking forward to doing that one next week. We hope you enjoyed this one. Be sure to check out the sciencefictionary.com for any related material we put up. You can also check out our TeePublic page, which can be found at thesciencefictionary.com by clicking on the shop link at the top. And there you will find a poster that we made of all of our pillars of science fiction. But until next week, Marisha, where can people find you?
You can find me on my website, princessesandpadawans.com, on Instagram at princesses_and_padawans, where you can see old stuff because I'm just not up to new stuff right now, and on Twitter, where I occasionally engage as P Padawans.
All right, David?
You guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at stay_creativeDD, and on my YouTube channel, Creative D&D, where I do podcast videos on all sorts of nerdy stuff.
And I'm Andrew Gore. You can find me running the Twitter account for this show at Sci_Fictionary. You can find me hosting our other show, Coruscant Radio Underground, where we talk about all things in that galaxy far, far away. You can drop us a line at thesciencefictionary@gmail.com. And you can find our podcast along with the rest of the Red 5 family at red5network.com. And until next time, live long and prosper.